My name is Amelia, and for as long as I can remember, I've suffered from a strange and terrifying affliction. I'm not blind. For me, everything seems normal, but every time I look in the mirror, all I see is the back of my head. The only upside to my problem is that it makes brushing my long blonde hair easy, but apart from that, it feels like a curse. The older I get, the worse I feel about it. It's really hard for me to explain it. People see me, but when they try to explain to me what I look like, the words they use to describe me don't seem to exist. It's the same for photos and even drawings of me. For one of my birthdays, my mother hired an artist to draw a portrait of me. My mother thought it would work. She figured if people couldn't paint me with words, they could capture my true appearance on canvas. The painter she hired was really talented and was famous in our town for being an amazing portrait artist. It didn't take long to see the frustration in the painter's eyes as she sat there for hours trying to draw me. By the time she was done, she had 4 beautiful pictures of the back of my head. Family photos were the worst and the most painful for me. Any of the family photos that made the wall had my family smiling proudly at the camera, but all you saw of me was the back of my head. I usually opted out of taking photos. It gets too depressing for me. It kind of feels like I don't exist. I'm present, but I don't have an identity. I've been seeing doctors for years, but no one ever gave me an answer for what might be causing this. I've had brain scans which always came back normal. I've seen countless psychologists, but they say I'm not crazy, because if that was the case, then everyone else would have to be crazy as well. The few photos and portraits of me prove it's not just in my head. I always struggled with the sense I didn't belong in this world. I always had a distorted view of the world. My parents put this down to my condition, but I always felt the two were interconnected. There was always this gnawing feeling of despair where I felt I wasn't meant to be born, or I existed between realms of existence. My mother told me it was normal to feel like that it was your typical teenage existential angst. But for me, it went a lot deeper than that. It wasn't hormones or a brain injury or mental defect. For me, it was a terrifying waking nightmare. When I was 17, I had my first school dance, and despite everything, I was excited. My best friend, Lily, helped me pick out a beautiful dress, a deep blue gown that complemented my long blonde hair. I felt almost normal for once, laughing with her as we styled each other's hair. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe I could blend in with the other girls, that maybe tonight I wouldn't feel so out of place. But as soon as we arrived at the dance, that fragile sense of normalcy began to crumble. That night truly shattered any feeling of belonging when the photographers arrived, going from group to group, capturing memories. I had been in a small circle of friends when the photographer called us over for a picture. I hesitated, but Lily urged me forward, assuring me that I looked beautiful. We lined up, and for the first time in years, I hoped desperately that maybe this time it would be different. Maybe tonight I would appear like everyone else. But when the photo printed out and made its way around the group, there it was again, the back of my head, while everyone else stood smiling and radiant. The laughter and excitement in my group died, replaced with awkward silence. Lily tried to comfort me, saying it didn't matter, but I couldn't bear it anymore. I slipped out of the dance hall, walking home alone. That night solidified the isolation I'd felt for years, but now it was worse. It wasn't just that I felt different, it was that I could never escape it. No matter how hard I tried to fit in, to be seen like everyone else, my reflection would always betray me. By the time my 18th birthday came around, the feelings of not belonging had all but consumed me. I had spent the entire night hunched over my desk, writing out my farewell letter to my family. My hands shook as I tried to explain the inexplicable, how living like this, always feeling out of place, was unbearable. When I finally finished, I folded the letter neatly and left it on my nightstand. Taking one last look in the mirror, I silently begged for something, anything that would give me a reason to stay. But all I saw was the back of my head, cold and distant, hiding what I was about to do. My father's gun felt heavy in my hand as I pressed it to the roof of my mouth. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. I expected darkness, an end. But instead, I woke up in my bed. For a moment, I thought the gun had misfired, that maybe I had failed. But there was no blood, no pain, no damage to my face. Everything was eerily calm. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the mirror. When I looked, I froze. A girl stared back at me, wide-eyed and confused, but it wasn't the back of my head, it was me. For the first time, I was seeing myself, a real face. She looked so unfamiliar yet undeniably me. My hair, my eyes, my features were all there, staring right back at me like the world had been flipped upside down. Panicked, I bolted from my room and raced down the stairs, but something strange caught my eye along the way. The family photos on the wall were all different. Every single person in them was turned away, their faces hidden, showing only the back of their heads, all except me. In each one, I stood facing the camera, smiling like nothing had ever been wrong, like I had always belonged there. It was impossible, and yet there I was, staring back at myself from the photos, as if this had always been my reality. As if the entire world had been reversed, and the terrifying thing was that I didn't seem to belong in this world either.
I live in a rural part of central Texas, down a dirt road a few miles off the highway. I'm on a 40-acre tract of land, mostly pasture for grazing cattle. My nearest neighbor is about a mile away, and past him the road dips down into a wooded area. If you follow the road down another mile from there, a solid concrete bridge with wide metal culverts crosses over a creek. About a week ago, I was taking a walk down the country road to clear my head. It may be October, but down here in Texas, temperatures are still pushing 90 degrees, and we haven't had more than a few drops of rain all month. As you might expect, when I got to the bridge, the creek was nearly dry. A small stream of water still flowed down the very center of the creek bed, but the rest of the channel was exposed, the clay beginning to crack from lack of rainfall. Ducking under the guardrail, I hopped down off the bridge to the surface of the creek and started heading upstream. The creek was fully shaded by live oaks and sycamores, and the banks were lined with scrub brush. Down inside the bed, wood fern and brookweed lay exposed and dried from lack of water, and tree roots weaved in and out of the clay. I took in the sights of nature, mainly focusing on my footing, and felt my stress melt away. Coming around a bend in the creek a solid mile from the bridge, I noticed a buck in the distance, drinking from the small trickle of water that still flowed. I froze, trying to make as little noise as possible to avoid spooking him. I quietly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone to snap a photo. I zoomed in and worked to get the distant image into focus. He must have been around 4 or 5 years old, judging from the size of the rack and broad, muscular body. At last, the focus came through, but while I tried to take the picture, I froze. Instead of the white fur I expected to see on the underside of the mouth of a deer this size, I saw red. Panning down, I saw that he wasn't drinking water at all. Hanging from the sharp, clearly non-herbivorous teeth were bits of fat and sinew as the animal tore through the fresh carcass of a bobcat. As I stared, stunned by what I was seeing, I shifted slightly and a twig snapped under my foot. The buck's head snapped to attention, his black, beady eyes staring directly at me. To my horror, it stood up on its hind legs and began to walk towards me. I turned and ran. My legs burned and my lungs heaved as I sprinted downstream. Behind me, I heard a high-pitched shriek, almost like a woman, which morphed and deepened into a feral roar in a sick glissando. In terror of what was behind me, I looked back over my shoulder, tripping over a tree root in the process. I tumbled forward, skinning my arm and landing painfully on my back. In a frenzy, I swung my head in every direction, terrified of the creature's pursuit. Not seeing it, I struggled to my feet and took off back home. Nearing the bridge, I heard a horrible laughter coming from behind the tree line, like a pack of coyotes, but slower and lower pitched. Dumb with fear, I scrambled up the concrete of the bridge, hitting my head against the metal guard. Heedless of my now bleeding forehead, I continued my desperate escape back down the road towards my house. Finally leaving the tree line and nearing my house, I felt my body dump the excess adrenaline. and the pain from my fall and collision with the guardrail came in full force. Exhausted, I limped my way the last bit home, bolting the door behind me. That was last week. Every night since then, I've woken up in the middle of the night. I'm a light sleeper, but usually in the country there isn't much noise to wake me. Coyotes, sometimes a car driving down the dirt road. But this is neither. Every night, waking from sleep, I hear a voice whisper my name. When I get up and go to the window to investigate, I can barely make out a dark shadow by the tree line and a faint, awful laughter.
Oak Neck doesn't show up on maps. Not really, not GPS maps anyway. But it is there, anyone can find it. If you know what turns to make in Mill Neck and Lattingtown, no, I won't tell you. Cat Hollow is harder. You need to start in Oak Neck and know the right road at the right time of day, but you can get there. Pine Island, however, requires a guide. I'm not rich, but I went to a rich kid college north of NYC. My mom worked in the bursar's office, so I got a major break on tuition. Enough of a break that I could live in the dorms, even though my parents were 10 minutes away in town. That was where I met Per. Per wasn't flashy new money rich like the other guys in our suite. His sneakers were beat to shit, and if his watch was expensive, it was impossible to tell because the case was too scratched to see the manufacturer. His car was definitely expensive when it was new, in the early 90s, but Per discovered right before winter break that even Bentleys need oil changes, or their engines will seize up. I agreed to give him a ride home. School was only 30 minutes north of the city, and he said his parents lived on the north shore of Long Island. Per insisted on a deal. He would buy my books for the spring semester, but I couldn't tell anyone where his parents lived. I didn't know that area particularly well, but I was still weirded out how far north we had to drive from the expressway. It felt like we should be in the middle of the Sound by the time we crossed the little road from Oak Neck to Cat Hollow as the sun was setting. Per, usually super laid back, sat up and got really intense, telling me, "You need to drive Widdershins on the creek road until you see the bridge." It turned out that this meant carefully driving counterclockwise on a foggy-ass one-lane road around what seemed to be a lake until just as the sun went down, a road appeared in the fog on a narrow strip of land that hadn't been there before. Pine Island isn't particularly special, sand dunes and spooky trees mostly, until you get to the bridge, which seemed impossibly huge and ornate, with what looked like gargoyles carved on the sides. He told me the name of the town as we crossed the bridge. I don't remember yet, but the rest of this came back to me. I'm assuming that will come too. It wasn't Nürnbergen, but that's what the people who are looking for it call it. I remember a bustling main street with a stave church rising in the mist at the end. The people were dressed different, not futuristic, but not old-timey either. It was like if everyone shopped at an LL Bean where the clothes were handmade by witches. Per directed me down a side street that led to a massive half-timbered house that loomed over the water's edge. It has a thatched roof and seemed to be built against a massive tree. Some sort of chain wrapped around the roof and the tree and wound down towards a huge stone well. The chain glistened gold in the moonlight. An angry-looking lady was waiting at the end of the driveway. After Per apologized and left with his suitcases, I could still see her pointing at my car and yelling at him as I drove off. It sounded like she was speaking another language, but also kind of like she was talking backwards somehow. I followed the directions he had carefully written down and got back to the dorms around midnight. When break was over, we both kept our deal. Kinda. Per bought my books, and I didn't tell anyone about his creepy-ass castle house. At first. But around February, after I had been dating this girl for a few months, one night we stayed up gossiping about everyone in our friend group. She told me about Danny's secret boyfriend and Mary Ellen's creepy crushes. I didn't have much to share, so I tried to tell her about Per's house. I couldn't talk. It wasn't like laryngitis. It was like my voice was paralyzed. The next morning I woke up to what felt like 100 mosquito bites on my legs. When I went in the bathroom, I saw that I had dozens of cuts up and down my legs, all in the shape of some symbol, like a little arrow pointing down with a slash through it. I didn't show my girlfriend or tell anyone. I spent the weekend in the school library looking up symbols. I finally found it. An Elder Futhark variation. An inversion of Tiwaz that was on the grave of a criminal. They called it the traitor rune. So I spent half the spring semester hiding that I had some kind of Viking accusation carved into my legs. I had to change my whole look. I had been the douchebag who wears shorts and a sweatshirt and Timberlands all winter. Per couldn't possibly know that I tried to tell, but he iced me out immediately after that and didn't come back in the fall. They healed, and you would think that would be my most memorable college experience. Except that I immediately forgot about the cuts and Per and the weird drive, and it stayed forgotten for 20 years. A while back I got into conspiracy podcasts. Not like the blowhard conservative ones, but like stuff about the Mandela effect and the elevator game and weird geography. I started to hear the word Nurembergen and it sent a shiver down my spine. It all started to come back. A little at first, then all at once. I went into my college keepsakes, and there amongst the ticket stubs and concert flyers was Per's handwritten notes on how to get back to school. I don't know what writing this down and posting it will do to me. I don't really know if I care. I don't have much going on these days and I'm not going to be bullied. You hear me? North Shore Snobtown Viking magic spirits. I see so much as a sinister scab and I'm posting these directions to a paranormal sub, and the conspiracy people can all go apple picking in your secret liminal space/private town.